Hello, everyone, and welcome to our concluding episode of this current season of ESG in Space. My name is Nishan Degnarain. I'm one of the hosts of the podcast.
And I'm Miki Sode. Thanks for joining us and thanks for sticking around for the whole season.
It's been fantastic having all of you join and having Miki as a co-host as we've explored this fascinating topic of ESG in space. And just to set some context on the journey that we've embarked upon, we started this podcast almost 2 years ago, and a year and a half ago, around October, November 2023, with a roundtable at Wharton around the space economy. It evolved into a series of white papers and discussions with a recognition that if the space economy is going to turn into a truly vibrant space economy, not one that is just solely government or military or scientific kind of funded, it will need more institutional capital, more private capital. But in order to do that, there are a couple of supporting infrastructure, scaffoldings. At the time when we were drafting and having discussions, ESG, environmental, social governance, was a really important vector through which a lot of institutional capital was flowing to different sectors as we were looking at the transformation of the global economy to more green, more sustainable, more ethical sectors. But what has happened since then is almost, I'm sure all of you know, is that with the US presidential election has been one of the kind of markers of this journey. There's been a significant disruption in the language that's used. Even the term ESG has become incredibly controversial. The policy direction, both public policy as well as corporate policy, as they've started evaluating where some of these investments flow into. And also strategic decoupling from major nations and the use of space as well. And so it's been a very interesting time that as we've launched this podcast, we've had a series of discussions in a very live and fast evolving and fast moving field. But I think one of the lessons that we've seen throughout has been that there are still two big questions that remain unanswered. I think number one, how can we attract more institutional capital into the private space economy to grow the private space economy and to ensure that the space economy is an important economic driver of the global economy? And then secondly, do we have the right institutional setup for this? Given what's happening in the world, how are we able to govern and channel institutional capital in the right way? So there are important lessons from the Earth domains, and some of our speakers touched on some of these topics. And so with that, maybe we should invite for our concluding episode our partner on this journey, Ian Christensen from Secure World Foundation. Ian, welcome. What have been some of your reflections on the podcast as you've listened to the episodes and been part of the original panel discussions and white papers and a supporter on this project?
Yeah, thank you, Miki. Thank you, Nishan, for first off for going through this journey over these 8 episodes that we recorded, and I think Nishan, you nicely encapsulated some of the kind of the sea changes that we've seen in the landscape over that period of time. I think we all expected, we're in an innovative, fast-moving industry, and we expected some change. I don't know that we expected the level of change that we've seen. So I think that does provide a nice lens to kind of look back and see how some of the themes that were elucidated through our discussions, how those themes and topics still resonate and still have relevance even in the midst of this disruption that you mentioned. So, starting from the ESG lens that we adopted in the title, and looking to what that means in the current landscape, as I reflect and listen to the episodes, kind of as an audience member, if you will, and kind of looking to learn myself. I heard a lot of talk about business continuity, assurance of mission, safety, how we mitigate and manage risks, and that those sorts of frameworks are still really relevant both to the operators and the folks doing the business, but to the users and to the folks providing financing and providing policy. So, maybe we don't talk as much about ESG as a lens, but some of the driving considerations behind that. I also heard a lot of talk about coordination, right? I think if you look back at the 8 guests we had quite a good range of perspectives and roles that those guests had. We have folks with kind of an operational business background. We had folks on the end user side. We had folks in advisory roles and reporting roles, right? A range of viewpoints on where they fall on the spectrum of the importance of regulation. But I think every single one of them talked about that we need coordination at some level as we go through this transition in the space economy. So I think what that coordination looks like, how we operationalize it, how we develop it, what the roles of different stakeholders are in that coordination, certainly an unanswered question, but that was a clear kind of theme that came out. I think we had a lot of talk about how you balance regulation, how you balance coordination, how you balance kind of open development in a growing economic sector, and that leads to a lot of the questions that we still, I think, have opportunity to explore both in our conversations, but more importantly in the broader industry development.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great place just to start. If we start to reflect on some of the takeaways from some of our speakers, I think you're right. Coordination was an important part. And if I think to some of our speakers, like Kevin from Delos, for example, he talked about making sure if there's coordination or even there's participation, this should be from all participants across the space value chain, including end users. And I think often what we've seen is that there's been a lot of focus on the producers of space, whether it's the rocket launcher satellite, but not as much focus on the end users. And if we are going to drive and pull adoption of space data or space technologies, whether it's manufacturing or other uses of space, we need a greater place for end users. Also, just more innovative business models for these last mile solutions. Like how do you deliver real value? How do you discover? There may be some unknown unknowns here or some known unknowns. Can space data, I think what Kevin is doing with Delos in terms of using space data to develop wildfire insurance in sectors that had previously been underrepresented is just a great example that there's a lot of value being left on the table, both for the producers of space data and potential end users, if we can join and match these together. So making sure that we are able to have a place for end users to be part of the discussion and greater discovery of the uses of space technologies is important. And then, I think linking to that, I know, Miki, if you had a reflection on that, but I remember Bruno's discussions from Clay and talking about, combining some of these space technologies with adjacent fields like AI, and that could open up new tools and new opportunities as well, right? Combining AI and space. Yeah. And so when you think about kind of some of those takeaways, Bruno talked about some of the governance challenges. We may talk about an ethical use of space technologies, but it's also the adjacency. What does the ethical supply chain look like in terms of the AI models that's being used, the data sets that are being used? And there's a trade-off between just pure market-driven approach and regulatory approaches, but that transparency and that trust throughout the space economy is going to be important. And so even when we talk about coordination may look very different. It may not look like the last 30 years of sitting around in a committee room in a UN type meeting, but coordination may mean things like open source data, maybe transparent model data, maybe just norms and cultures that we set about in our place. But that was one of the big takeaways that I took away from Bruno. And I think Bruno's mission with Clay in terms of democratizing and empowering individuals to access both AI and data is going to open up, revolutionary new sectors, but at the same time there'll be a need to instill these sectors with a sense of responsibility.
So I think, Nishan, one of the things that as you're going through what Bruno and Kevin talked about, right? One of the other themes that came out is this transition we're seeing, that space is changing from this government-driven market to one where we have a transition in end users and types of businesses involved. In parallel to that, market transition is a governance transition, right? We've always kind of assumed that the government-to-government forums drive our coordination principles, and then maybe operator safety considerations, also inform that. But as more end users come in, I think there's going to, we got to look at what an end user push, if you will, for coordination looks like, and how those voices become part of the stakeholder set that needs to be involved in governance or coordination conversations around space data and access and use of space applications. And so that's another level here that I think is going to become more important, and some of our existing processes don't really account for that very well, be those business processes or governance processes.
For me, I always think about innovation, and my favorite definition of innovation is the art of establishing something new or different in the real world that has significant impact. And I think that, space technology and, we have enough power or tools to make an impact. But I think Kevin and Bruno, with their effort, is like really pushing that and giving those power to the end user, so that it could. I think we could have a better business model, circular economy around space. Enable data, services, technology, and products in the hands of people, and then by doing so, kind of I think instill the responsibility to keep that going too. Yeah.
No, absolutely. I think that's a really good point, because there are certain principles, and being close to end users, let's say the new generation of consumers, for example, who want to see principles of circular economy or circularity there, is going to be important. And I think Karen mentioned that from Aerospace Corp, when she was in our podcast talking about there are things like the critical mineral supply chain, right, where we don't have a bountiful access to certain mineral rules that play a critical role in, let's say, the efficacy of solar power or kind of laser communications in space. And so we need to be fairly conservative about how we use those resources, and that will open up business models. She talked about whether we could create the Uber for satellites, where you have one or two providers, but in a place where we're starting to get concerned about the overcrowding in space in certain areas, how do those new business models open up new end users, new use cases, reduce the cost, but also increase the kind of the effectiveness of how we use that space region. So you're right. It may, we may not use the language of ESG standards, but there may be certain principles like circular economy or kind of just some of the economics of space sustainability that ensure that we are much better coordinated in space to make sure that this is a domain that can benefit multiple generations going forwards. When I think also, building on that, I mean these are kind of, Kevin, Bruno, and Karen were all talking at first about from a private sector perspective, but then we then touched onto the government domains, right? And to Ian's point earlier about is this a new type of governance, and we are seeing that evolution. So Jonathan from Singapore's National Space Office played a really interesting role, Austin, OSTIN, where we're looking at these new emerging middle space powers, right? We had the traditional, NASA's, Russia, obviously kind of the Chinese space agencies, JAXA, the European Space Agency. But as we see more nations coming in, like the Singapores or the Saudi or the UAE models, there's a question, well, how do we think about the roles that they would want to play? And Jonathan gave some really important perspective about, as a smaller nation, the role of coordination and communication is important. How do you create the balance between over-regulation and Singapore, which is business-friendly, attracting the right business models? And one of the big takeaways that I took from our discussion with Jonathan was, do we have the right workforce ready? He talked, as you sit there attracting new businesses, he's also trying to identify what the needs of the future would look like, and raise an important question that are we, right now we're training scientists and engineers in space, but actually do we have a pathway for space entrepreneurs or space regulators or space coordinators of the future? I know that's a topic that's very passionate to both of you, Miki, Ian, and education and workforce development.
Yeah, I mean, I sit here as a person with a policy background, right, and have found the way to get involved in space, and it's not it's not technical stuff is clearly important. Engineering is clearly important. Science, right, all of that drives innovation in our sector. But to really develop, we have to think about, I think, the human capital in a more holistic way. And I think that's Jonathan touched on it. And I think came up with a couple of other interviews, but I think it's a really good theme for future exploration, no pun intended, as we go here.
Yeah, I think we heard the same message from Bill Diamond of Citi as well, that like we need to do more outreach and workforce development or education, because the sharing and understanding will lead to caring and responsibility too. So I think that these are a strong thread for sure.
Yeah, and Bill was fascinating because he talked about this bigger mission, right? That, space is not just a technical domain, but this is a field about, inspiration, a sense of purpose, a sense of service. And, I will say that one takeaway that I had from all the interviewees that we had on the podcast is that they were all thinking about this bigger mission. They weren't thinking about their private or small interests. They were saying, this is something that's going to define civilization. This is going to define the next frontier, what it means to be human as a species. And so space was much bigger than any one individual, and they all recognized that. They all had different perspective, but they all recognized that. I think Bill talked about that in particular, from that SETI mission, that need to be inclusive. He mentioned certain, even communities, like indigenous communities and others who may not be spacefaring today, but still care about space, because the navigators of the past had used the stars as celestial guides to cross the oceans. A lot of indigenous communities look at features in the sky for religious and important cultural parts of the calendars or festivals. And so that's going to be something for us to recognize and ensure that those viewpoints are reflected in how we use space for the benefit of all humanity.
Yeah.
I think one other element that kind of came out in some of our guests is relating back to human capital and back to how we drive forward in this kind of exploration and inspirational purpose. The experience that we've already built up and how we use that to inform where we go in the future. So I think Abhi in particular from Berkeley, right, talked a little bit about we should let the norms and our current practice inform how we go. So we've learned a lot in LEO. What do we take from that to build out our cislunar activities and our space resources activities? He raised, I think, the idea of a learning period around human spaceflight, right? And so kind of coming back to the coordination discussion, but needing to build in that experience. I think we can look back and say that's technical experience, but it's also cultural experience. It's also experience in business practices, right? So just that non-technical element as well. So that kind of an interesting, I think, element that came from his guest appearance.
And Abhi had that very interesting perspective that it's, there's a spectrum on interventions, and part of this starts with, just education and cultural norms, almost like a certification or some sort of understanding about how we should be operating in space, grounded on business realities, grounded on operator experience, and there's a spectrum before we need to regulate or coordinate. And so I think some of that is important as we start to recognize those who are participating in the space field. And I wouldn't say on the other side of that, but just along that spectrum will be Sabrina's perspective at KPMG, and who's had a deep involvement with the role of the European Union, where the EU has become a regulatory force in many domains, like data, for example, with GDPR and regulation of ethical AI, and they're trying to play a similar role in the space domain. And EU is a big player. Luxembourg is a big attractor of space-based companies, the European Space Agency. And she's seeing this affect the entire life cycle of space, vehicle development by big producers like Airbus, for example. So it's having real world impact, and maybe setting an important benchmark or data point for us to look at. I think the concept she used was sustainability by demand, right? And these reporting frameworks, which set standards. So it will be interesting to see the Abhi approach about, whether we need a learning period, almost a policy sandbox, and the EU perspective talk about Sabrina, which is like top down, and let's set some parameters, and from that see what evolves.
And James added to that too. I think he had a similar point of view that maybe EU space law is coming coming out soon. I think he was mentioning that could potentially create a Brussels effect of like of the great global space governance, and that the EU could play middle power to coordinate that too. I saw something like a similar, like I associate that with the message that Jonathan had that too, on the Asia side. Yeah.
Yeah, and James, too, formerly being part of Inmarsat and the role that Inmarsat played just in terms of safety at sea, delivering a mission that could not have been delivered by any other vehicle than through space. If you're in a vessel far out, you're literally in a life-saving critical role, and that is a role that Inmarsat played, which was a public/private development, interesting model. And he used the language of a trusted space economy, and I think. That's something as we reflect, and yes, language and vocabulary is a contested space right now, but I think what we are talking about is trusted. Trust is a really important parameter to trust, the positioning dynamics of where one vessel is, to trust that there's going to be some sort of communication, to trust the processes and the teams that are out there if they're from different cultures. And so, and that's also if private capital is going to invest the billions or tens of billions of dollars needed in the space infrastructure, trust has got to be foundational to how this sector is evolving to create an orderly development of the sector. Otherwise, you'll get a development that we've seen in other industrial sectors that haven't been trust-based and have led to not quite the same outcomes that we would like to have seen.
Yeah, I like that framing of trust, right? Because it's multi-levels, right? It gets at trust and safety and coordination, right? Which is a key theme that came up, but it also gets to trust and outcomes, right? So going back to that inspiration, and this is a broader community, right? So yes, we want to, in the industry, profit motivations and develop new economic opportunities, but it's also this domain that is a shared domain and a domain where we talk a lot about benefit for all, right? And so trust comes back into that as well, the trusted outcomes of activities. I think, Miki, from your design background, we've talked about intersections, and I don't know if trust and intersections comes up as well, right?
Yeah, and I think the intersection of different seemingly opposing forces, but actually bridging that is a great design opportunity. And I think from hearing all the speakers for this season, I felt that when we were thinking about coordination, the adaptability is important to incorporate into the design of the coordination, and also with the sustainability in mind from early on, right? And then the intersection to bridge between, say, technology to everyday life, right? Like it seems, again, like in a great example, again, is like Bruno or Kevin, where like the technology is like used to the real examples of the wildfire protection or insurance, and also like some other bridging between tensions between global governance, meet local needs, or the market forces versus sustainability goals. I think there are that's the area that requires lots of coordination, but also we need to approach with intention that we need to bridge that gap, or else there will be a like a broken link in that circularity too. So yes.
So this is interesting because throughout these 8 episodes, I think there were some important takeaways, but there were also some unresolved questions, right? Which would be great to explore as part of a further series of whether they're podcasts or conversations or engagement with a broader audience as well. I mean, I think I agree. Like some of the takeaways that this is an incredibly unique domain versus some of the other domains. It's a domain that's going to define humanity. This inspiration point that you mentioned that Bill talked about as well. This is something bigger than any one individual, any one organization, and we're creating the precedent for this and being the first generation of stewards if you like, of the space economy that we're hopefully going to see multiple generations and build on what did this generation create as the first real stewards of a spacefaring nation, right? Or spacefaring civilization. I think, part of that means that how do we build and develop the workforce of the future? Is it just going to be by accident, or is it going to be by design, by intent? So we do need to reflect on that. Other adjacencies, we talk, yes, there's engineers and scientists rightly involved in discovering space, but the role of finance is going to be incredibly critical. We see this in other industries, whether it's actual investment capital or risk capital from an insurance perspective. So how do you bring these voices in and create more vibrant and appropriate financial product? And that also means establishing linkages with different value systems over this shared space. We have different understanding of what a private sector enterprise means, right? Different business practices, different policy practices. And so when we're working with nations like China and Russia and India and Japan and the EU and the US and smaller nations, how do we create that? We've had collaboration with the International Space Station, which is being decommissioned. And so where else are we going to start to create that collaboration and that shared space? And aspirationally, could we find ways that the space economy could be a force multiplier for global GDP? That could there be an aspiration in every nation that if 1% of the GDP can be powered by some sort of space economy data, right? It doesn't mean necessarily having spaceports in every nation. I think that's a point that you've made quite strongly. But using that data, how do we help lift the aspirations of a nation because they can identify wildfire, illegal fisheries, safety at sea, for example. There may be a range of other sectors like wet space weather monitoring, for example, that can all of a sudden enhance the GDP, and that in itself attracts more capital investments and interest. And at the core of that is trust, right? And I think those were some of the important takeaways that I took away certainly from this series.
Yeah, I think you give us a good list of areas that we can continue to discuss and explore in future episodes or future conversations. And I would love, as kind of one of the partners here, I would love to hear from the folks that listen to these episodes. Are these themes that we're picking up here in this conversation, are they resonating with you? Did you all hear other things in it? Where should we go in the future? I hope this is an open conversation.
Yeah. And so with that, Miki, is there any final words, any questions you would like to see explored further? Anything you'd want from our listeners or audience in terms of feedback before we embark on a next series of questions and interviews?
Yeah, well, first of all, I had so much fun doing this podcast series, but working with you all too. And I want to thank all the speakers who joined us this season. And I also feel like we just got started. I would love to continue the conversation. And like Ian said, I would love to hear from our audience, some other voices that you might want to hear or we should cover. I think, again, we meant this project and podcast to be a platform to bridge the gaps or the opportunities for everybody to participate to make space vibrant and accessible, beneficial to all for years to come, decades and to come, generations to come. So yes, I would say let's keep the conversation going.
So with that, I'd like to echo Miki's well. It's been a pleasure and a joy being a co-host with you, Miki, and partnering with yourself, Ian. So thank you for being a wonderful partner. I think we've had a wonderful set of conversations. We'd like Miki said, we'd like to thank all of our speakers who've joined us this season. It has been a vibrant and educational experience. And I'd also like to thank our audience who I know have engaged with us on various social media platforms, direct feedback to us. And so we are very grateful for that interaction. It's a sign that, as Miki said, we're in a voyage of discovery. We're still trying to understand what this domain could look like and how to succeed. And the only way we're going to do this is by advancing together and advancing our collective knowledge together. And that is the intent of this podcast. And so with that, from this season of ESG in Space, maybe we'll be back with a different title, but something with trust in there. I'd like to thank all of you and hope you'll continue to engage with us. And we look forward to speaking with you all very soon. From Miki, myself, and Ian, bye-bye for now.
Thank you.